everyone, and welcome to the Orthodox Leader. My name is Ann Mitsakos Bezarides, and I'm here today with Deacon Michael Hyatt. How are you doing, Deacon Michael?
I'm doing great, Ann. I'm just loving the weather. Fall's my favorite time of year, and it's just had a great service this morning, Divine Liturgy, all that. How about you?
So good. It also has been gorgeous here. We had last week, I told you we had a little one injury. This week we had another with my kids. So it's one injury a week, but otherwise we're great, and we're thankful for the weather. Thankful that it is this beautiful season of fall. We had lots of cherry tomatoes for dinner tonight.
Oh, yummy.
Yeah. So thanks to all of you for joining us today for episode number 3. The goal of this podcast is to give Orthodox clergy and lay leaders the knowledge, tools, and resources they need to be better stewards of their influence and have greater impact on the organizations they lead. Today, we're continuing our mini-series on leadership disciplines. At the beginning of the series, we discussed why this is important. Deacon Michael's premise is that you must lead yourself if you're going to be effective in leading others. In other words, self-leadership is the foundational, most fundamental kind of leadership. Before we go too much further, Deacon Michael, will you unpack that for us a bit?
Yeah, the funny thing about self-leadership is that it's hard. The hardest person I've ever tried to lead in my life was me. Because as it turns out, I resist my best intentions. And we're going to unpack that a little bit as we go through it. But the reason this is so important, because as leaders, there's this thing that I like to call the law of replication. And what it means is that like begets like. Who we are, our character is going to get replicated in the lives of those we lead. And we've probably seen this in various organizations. They kind of take on a culture or the mannerisms of the leader. And, things get replicated that aren't always intended to be replicated. But I first became aware of this as I was reflecting upon my dad. He's still living. He's 87 years old. But my dad was almost killed, but really injured in the Korean War. And so he had an incoming mortar shell that he ended up getting some shrapnel in his head. He was unconscious in a coma for 6 months, had a number of surgeries on his head. But the upshot of that was that he had a severe limp. He wasn't, thank God, wasn't in a wheelchair, but he had a severe limp all of his adult life. And by the way, he went into the Marines when he was 17. And so this injury happened when he was 18. I mean, barely a man. And he had this injury. So he always limped. Now, here I am as a little boy growing up in Western Nebraska, looking up to my dad, who was my hero, and wanting to emulate everything that I saw my dad do, right? So my dad limped, and I started just unconsciously developing this limp. And I could remember when I was about, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5, my mom saying to me, she said, Michael, you don't need to limp. Dad limps because he was hurt in the war. That's a result of an injury. So she explained the whole thing to me, and she said, see all these other men, they don't limp. You don't have to limp. You can walk like these other men. And it was such a lesson, particularly reflecting on me about how these unconscious things that we have as leaders get replicated in the lives of those that we're trying to lead. And that's why self-control is so critically important. Because if we don't have it, if we have, for example, outbursts of anger, or if we have difficulty, with whatever, depression or sadness or anxiety or whatever. And obviously there's sometimes clinical reasons why, those are issues that need professional help, but they're going to show up in the lives of those we lead. So self-control is really important for that reason.
That's so helpful. I can't wait to dig in a little bit more. And the sweet story of thinking of little Deacon Michael Hyatt limping around as a 4-year-old because his dad did it's dear. It's such a great image of how we model the people we admire. So as we dig in and begin, let me encourage you to post your questions in the comment section of YouTube or wherever you happen to be watching. Deacon Michael will be answering those questions live in the second half of the show. So Deacon Michael, let's start with the definition. How do you define self-control?
Okay, so as I was preparing for this particular episode, Ann, I went to the fount of all knowledge, which is the dictionary on my Mac. And I said, let's just start there. How does the dictionary define self-control? And so it says this, it's quote, the ability to control oneself, in particular one's emotions and desires, or the expression of them in one's behavior, especially in difficult situations. Now, I have to say that self-control is not something that I grew up thinking a lot about. And in fact, I used to think that my emotions and my thinking and all that was just kind of automatic, that there was nothing I could do to control it. Till I was first, after I became a Christian, I was introduced to the concept of self-control. But that definition, it's good as far as it goes. It emphasizes sort of what I would call the restraint aspect of self-control. It's negative in a sense that we want to avoid the thoughts and the words and the actions that are detrimental to ourselves and to other people. But it misses the cultivation aspect of self-control. It's not just that self-control is about things we don't want to do. Self-control involves things we do want to do, behaviors that we do want to do, cultivating the thoughts and the words and the actions that are useful to ourselves and others. So I want to propose a new definition, or a definition for the purpose of this episode that we can use. And it's this, quote, self-discipline is the ability to think, speak, and act in a way that is congruent with our best intentions. And it involves both the restraint of negative behavior and the cultivation of positive behavior. And I think it might help for some people to think when we're talking about self-control, we're talking about the opposite of self-indulgence, where we don't exercise any constraint or cultivation. We just try to be authentically who we are and manifest that to the world. Well, that's not always a great idea. But yeah, so that's kind of my definition.
I love it. I was ruminating on this a lot in preparation for the show, and I was thinking a lot about just where it pops into my head as, the verse that's memorized, right? Which is
Right.
the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. The last in that list of amazing, all those good things, all the good qualities, right? And I was thinking about it, and it seems the most sort of rigid of them, like of all this wonderful stuff, it's the one you're sort of control of. And yet what's so powerful is that if you look at that verse in context of the larger chapter in Paul's letter to the Galatians, all of these are a response to the freedom we have in Christ. The whole
Yeah.
chapter is rooted in the freedom we have in Christ. And so self-control and all of the rest of these fruit of the Spirit are actually not a set of rules we have to follow, but rather our response, our sort of free will response, which I find is such an important shift, like a mental shift, that it's not that I have to control myself to be good, but rather my control is because I love Christ.
Right. And it's kind of the result or the consequence of doing some other things. It's fruit. And so a fruit tree doesn't have to work hard to produce the fruit. It has to do some things. It has to be in the right soil. It has to have the right water, enough sunshine and all that. We're going to talk about the environmental factors related to self-control here in a minute, but it's the fruit. And while it's not effortless, it's also not this white knuckle thing where we go, oh, I just got to control myself. I got to keep from doing the things that I know that are going to be offensive or detrimental to other people. By the way, one of the commenters asked, that happens to be my wife. She asked if I could repeat the definition of self-control. So let me just do that again. Self-discipline is the ability to think, speak, and act, all three, in a way that's congruent with our best intentions. It involves both the restraint of negative behavior and the cultivation of positive behavior.
I love it. There's an element of just integrity there.
Yes. And therein lies the challenge.
Yeah.
To get all of our behaviors to line up with our intentions.
It's great. So talk a little bit more about why you think we all struggle with self-control.
Well, I do think this is the universal human condition. And as I was preparing for this, I wrote down three reasons. I think, first of all, we're sinful human beings. And by the way, that's not the whole story, because we're also made in the image of God. So we're made in the image of God, but we are in a fallen world and we're sinful human beings. So I mentioned this passage from St. Paul's epistle to the Romans last week. And I think that was a little bit different context, but I want to mention it again because I think that what he describes is enormously familiar to all of us. And I think if somebody as great as the Apostle Paul struggled with this, that I don't have to feel, shame around this or think that I'm the exception. No, this is pretty much the human condition. So he says in Romans 7:15-20, he says, "For what I will to do, that I do not practice, but what I hate, that I do." And I mean, I can think of situations, and you probably can too, where something came out of my mouth and I just wanted to, hit my forehead against the wall, because it's like, I know better. Why am I not saying what I know to say? Or why did I say that thing that I knew I shouldn't have said? Or why did I post that on social media? I know better than that by now. So he continues, he says, "If then I do what I will not to do, I agree with the law that is good, but now it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me. For I know that in me, that is in my flesh, nothing good dwells. For to will is present with me, but how to perform what is good, I do not find. For the good that I will to do, I do not do. But the evil I will not to do, that I practice. Now, if I do what I will not to do, it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me." So this side of heaven, we still have to contend with our carnal nature, the old man. And that part of us, all of life is this process of theosis where we're becoming more and more like Christ. But kind of here in the messy middle that we call life, it's a struggle, and first and foremost, because we're sinful human beings, and that's just the world that we're into. So that was kind of my first reason. You have any comment on that, or should I go on?
It's good. Keep going.
Okay.
I'm with you. Right there with
Okay,
you.
good. So number two is we live in a world that really, I think, encourages self-indulgence. The idea of self-control is probably well known when it comes to athletics. Somebody that, can get up every day and do the workouts and go through the training and do all the things they need to do for the sake of a goal. But I think in general, our culture has pretty much given up on the idea of self-control and is basically baptized or sort of given legitimacy to self-indulgence. So from the world's perspective, I think when most people think of self-control, it's kind of a negative thing. Like it's the enemy of freedom. And the way to get free, the way to experience freedom is, I think for most people in the world, is to throw off all constraints and simply indulge in whatever you want or whatever you desire. There are no limits. And this, I think we have to say, is the essence of hedonism. It turns pleasure into an idol where we're just suing pleasure for pleasure's sake. And, this is probably an overused example, but the sexual revolution is perhaps the best example of this. And it just keeps progressing. Wherever the boundaries were 100 years ago, those boundaries got moved, and then they got moved again, and they got moved again, and they got moved again, and they got moved again. And pretty much today, there's nothing off limits. And I can definitely foresee a time in the near distant future when there really aren't. There's not any criteria for sexual expression other than if it makes you feel good, if it makes you happy, do it. And that's kind of a scary thing. I was also thinking, Ann, that, here, I know probably not everybody on is from the U.S. like we are, but I think part of what was inherent in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights was the idea of self-governance, that you can never create a government that's big enough and powerful enough to control people. People have to exercise self-control or self-governance if you're going to have, a civil society where people treat one another with dignity and with respect.
So good. it's interesting as you talk about sort of athletes and the control, self-control needed to be a top athlete. What's so interesting is that there is this, so many people now are trying to push themselves in triathletes, triathlons and Ironman and, all sorts of different extreme things, and have a whole regimen to do that. It's almost like affirming that there is a human wiring towards self-control if we pay attention to sort of to that aspect of our internal being, that we're wired to think about self-control, to accomplish any goal, to get there.
Yeah, that's a really interesting comment, because my daughter and son-in-law were all set up to run a Tough Mudder. Do you know what that is? This fall?
Yeah.
And you think, why would anybody subject themselves to this? These are grown humans, and they're going to subject themselves to that. And I think you're right. I think there's this sort of innate need to strive for something that's going to require sacrifice. And I think that one of the things that appealed to me when I became Orthodox is that it demanded something of me. I think that, prior to that, when I was a Protestant, and I'm not, just ragging on Protestants, but one of the things that I was very aware of is that faith was trying to accommodate itself to me, to my weaknesses, to my foibles, so it didn't require much of anything. The services were arranged so that they were convenient, so that they weren't too long, so the music was enjoyable, so the sermon was entertaining, but in my heart of hearts, I thought there's got to be more. And I remember reading a book years ago at the University, to see if you read this. This is one of the best leadership books I've ever read. It's called Leadership and Dedication. And it's written by a Roman Catholic who used to be, and this was written back in the 60s, I think, but this was written about, he was comparing what Christianity demands to what the Communist Party would demand of its members. And he was saying that one of the reasons why Christianity was losing its influence in the West was because it was accommodating itself to the culture. And the thing that he said that the communists did was they demanded big demands on people. Like if you want to be in the Communist Party, you had to stand out on the street corner, hand out pamphlets, hand out newspapers, get abused and all that. And they didn't sugarcoat it. They said it's hard being a communist in the West. If you're going to be one, it's going to cost you dearly. And so all they did was grow. So, and I think that kind of also describes the church of the early centuries. Those people that became Christians almost immediately were subjected to persecution and abuse. And many of them knew that they would die because of their allegiance to Christ. And yet all it did was grow. And it seems like, unfortunately, in our society, we keep asking the wrong question. How do we make this more comfortable? How do we make this easier? How do we make it so we don't have to have any self-control whatsoever?
It's great. Okay, so take us, you have a third.
Oh, yeah, I forgot that one. Okay, yeah, so there's a third reason why I think it's so hard. And that is, we have an enemy that's constantly tempting us. And, again, we could sugarcoat this. We could act like this is, I remember I had a theology professor in college that said the devil wasn't real. It was just a personification of evil. It's a literary device, a metaphor, if you will. And I don't think that doesn't represent really the history of what the church teaches or what we've experienced, certainly. But the devil constantly tempts us to give in to our desires and indulge our sinful passions. So we don't have to go any further than Genesis chapter 3 to see this very thing, where Satan encourages Adam and Eve to doubt God's word and even his intentions toward them. And I think that, as we pray in the Lord's Prayer, deliver us from evil, and more accurately translated, deliver us from the evil one, that we do have an opponent. We have an adversary who's out to take us down. And I think that's just a reality that in this postmodern culture is easy to forget and, be totally materialistic. But there is a spiritual realm out there, and not all of it's good. And not all of it has good intentions toward us.
It's great. So listeners out there, as you're thinking about this, what are the big questions you have around self-control and its relationship to leadership? What questions do you want to ask Deacon Michael in the second half of the show? We'd love to respond to them. So, Deacon Michael, as a leader, why is self-control important? So we know why it's important as Christians for our life as Christians, but where does it play into leadership?
Yeah, I think the stakes, and for the reasons I shared at the very beginning, because of this law of replication, they go up. And a couple things I was thinking of here. First, a lack of self-control can disqualify you from serving God. Wow. Yeah. So this morning at the Divine Liturgy, I was serving as a deacon, of course, as I do almost every week. And when we get to the prayer, right before the cherubic hymn, right before the anaphora in the Divine Liturgy, the priest prays this private prayer. And I always prayed along with the priest. I prayed quietly, and he, says it out loud. But it starts like this. And those of you who are listening who are clergy will recognize this. Many of you have it memorized. But no one who is bound with the desires and pleasures of the flesh is worthy to approach or draw nigh, or to serve thee, O King of glory. For to serve thee is a great and terrible thing, even to the heavenly powers. So there is a sense in which, in that liturgy of St. John, he makes it clear that a lack of self-control can disqualify us from service to God. Now, the beautiful thing about that prayer is it goes on to talk about the grace of God and the forgiveness, and the fact that we can serve is not based on, our ability to live the Christian life or to live it perfectly, certainly, but we've got to be honest in our pursuit of it. And if we're struggling with self-indulgence or whatever, we've got to do some internal work before we go forward. And I think that conversely, self-control is one of the things, not the only thing, but one of the things that qualifies you to serve God. And I started to read in Titus chapter 1, 7 through 9. And this gives the qualifications for a bishop or an overseer, as it's sometimes translated. Back in those early days, there's a lot of scholarly debate as to whether, in the first century, at least the early part of that, the office of bishop and the office of elder almost seem to be one and the same. But regardless of whether you think this applies to bishops, as it says, or also to elders, which is not a bad thing, here's what it says. For a bishop must be blameless as a steward of God. And I want you to just pay attention to how much of this has to do with self-control. Not self-willed, not quick-tempered, not given to wine, not violent, not greedy for money. But, so that's sort of that negative aspect of self-control. These are the things we have to restrain. But then it goes on to the positive aspect, the things that we have to cultivate. But a bishop must also be hospitable, a lover of what is good, sober-minded, just, holy. And note this, self-controlled. Right here, it's repeated again. Holding fast the faithful word as he has been taught, that he may be able by sound doctrine both to exhort and convict those who contradict. And again, that's Titus 1, 7 through 9. So, doesn't that sound like self-control?
It's amazing. It's an amazing passage right there.
It is, and convicting.
Right. It's right there. It's right in the middle of it. Self-controlled.
I know. And there's a similar passage for deacons. I'm not going to read that, but you could read in those pastoral epistles, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, their qualifications for bishops, presbyters, and deacons. So here's another reason why I think it's important to have self-control. A lack of self-control can diminish or even decimate your influence with other people. That word that is, spoken in anger, or that indiscretion. Back when I was 19 years old, I was going to college in the daytime, and I was working at a 7-Eleven at night. And I had just become a Christian. I'd only been a Christian maybe 18 months. And so I'm working the 11 to 7 shift at a 7-Eleven. So I had the night shift. And sadly, I would get this Orthodox priest that would come in every night. We had to stop selling alcohol. at 12 o'clock at night. And so he would come in at about 1 o'clock, already drunk, and he couldn't buy alcohol. So he would buy cough medicine because it had alcohol in it and proceed to drink it in front of me and try to engage me in a conversation. And the sad part about it was he was for all practical purposes an atheist. I don't know what went on in his life, and I'm not trying to judge him. I'm just saying that so turned me off to orthodoxy that I would have never considered it just because of the example of his life. And sadly, that's what can happen. That's that law of replication. That's that like we were talking about last week, the wake that the boat leaves behind. There's always an impact on other people. So this self-control thing is important, not just in our relationship to God and how it qualifies or disqualifies us, but how it influences other people. So when you, and conversely, I'd say when you have self-control as a leader, here's what it does. It, especially with regard to your words and actions, because that's what other people experience. But when we have self-control there, that builds trust. And that trust is a prerequisite for influence. The reality is we don't let people influence us unless we trust them. And so when we exercise self-control, self-restraint, when we do the little things that matter that come out of self-control, that enables us to influence other people, and not for our own ends, but for the glory of God and the advancement of the kingdom. And then I would say the third thing, the other reason why it's important, and this is where I think we got to ask, okay, look, what's ultimately at stake? Both positively and negatively. Well, a lack of self-control can destroy your reputation and get you fired. And, there's been lots and lots of examples in the news in years gone by and even in recent weeks. I just happened to have the news on yesterday morning and was looking at all the news with regard to Chris Cuomo, who's an anchor on CNN, who was involved in an indiscretion with a former boss. And probably I would not be surprised if he doesn't get fired over this, because it was sexual misconduct. And it may have been one of those things that maybe he thought he was never going to get caught. Maybe he thought it wasn't that big a deal. But in this culture, you just can't be too careful. So this, of course, is not just limited to the general culture. And this is the sad part. We have some of this in the church. And it's not limited to one denomination. I wish I could, point to, one denomination that's come off the rails and say, this is endemic in their denomination, but as Orthodox, we're above that. Well, we're really not. I told the one story about the priest, but we all kind of know of priests or even bishops who were defrocked or maybe even terminated because of some form of indiscretion. So there's a lot at stake here. And I think that there's one thing where the devil tempts us is to think that this situation that we're in is temporary and nobody will ever know. And I keep thinking of the verse in the scripture, be sure your sins will find you out. And that's where I think we've got to be sober-minded. We've got to remember what it's at stake, and we have to comport ourselves appropriately. Does that make sense?
Makes a lot of sense. We actually, in the office, and I think I got this from my time at seminary, but we say the only scandal should be the cross, ideally.
Yes.
And that's what we want people to stumble over, is that it didn't make sense that we have a God who chose to be crucified on a cross. And that's the scandal we should struggle with. And laity shouldn't, ideally don't have to then also struggle with the behavior of their leaders and what that means for how they think about and choose to trust or not trust their own leader.
Yeah.
So here's two hard questions for you I was thinking about. So we all struggle with self-control. We're all sinful. So if I'm listening to you as a leader right now, how do I know if my self-control issues disqualify me as a leader or not? And then the second question, which is sort of related, is if I'm listening to this podcast and think, okay, my issues sound like they might like they might be more scandal than they should be. What do I do?
Well, I'd say, first of all, get help. This is why, we have the office of the priesthood and why we have the hierarchy. And I think that that's something that could be discerned with a spiritual father. And I think that, there are some sins that, we'll just experience again and again, and we make a little bit of progress. And sometimes it feels like it's 3 steps forward and 2 steps back. And I remember confessing to a priest years ago some sin, and I was kind of embarrassed. And I said to him, I said, I feel like I keep coming to you with the same sin over and over. And then he quoted a story. I don't know if this is the Desert Fathers. I can't remember where he got it, but he said to me, well, what do you want? New sins? Does that make it any better? And I thought, that's a good point. I think there's a difference between, sort of one-off sins where we trip and fall and then repent, and there's almost every sin, maybe we can think of an exception, but almost every sin we can recover from, because there is, with God, there is grace and there is forgiveness, and we have the sacrament of confession and all of that. I think what can disqualify us is when we get so comfortable with the sin that we're unrepentant. We refuse to acknowledge it. And I would say that that's usually what gets people booted, is the unwillingness to deal with the sin. They want to act like it doesn't exist. And I would say that if there's some sin that you're struggling with, like maybe I'll just, give one. It's like if you feel like you're prone to overdrink, that may be something where you need professional help, or AA or something else. No shame in that. The fastest way to get from where you are to where you want to be is the truth. And, Jesus himself said, the truth shall set you free. And I know it's hard, it's difficult, but that's where we have to begin. And here's the thing. I was telling you about a priest before we came on, who's a friend of mine, who's a recovered alcoholic. And guess what? Now he has an amazing ministry among alcoholics because he's to use the words of Henry Nouwen, he's a wounded healer. He's somebody that's personally experienced the thing. So when he's talking about drinking and alcohol addiction with alcoholics, it's not theoretical. It's not something he learned in graduate school. This is something he experienced and wrestled with for years and tripped and fell and all the other things. So I think we just have to keep an open heart and be willing to repent and keep getting up and dusting ourselves off.
That's great. So listeners, please post your questions in the comments section. We can't wait to dig into them. And before we do that, Deacon Michael, where does self-control come from? The name would suggest it's solely our responsibility, self-control. But I wonder.
Yeah, and I've sometimes had people say that to me, people that are maybe not as familiar with the scripture or forgot that verse about it being the fruit of the Spirit. They'll just say, oh, I need to leave myself out of this. And again, the word self suggests that it's up to us. We're responsible for controlling ourselves. We just need to somehow force ourselves to do what we know is right, to white knuckle this thing and just, get serious this time and be more disciplined. However, I think the passage I quoted from Romans 7 earlier proves that it's not that easy, even for someone as spiritual, someone as great a saint as St. Paul. And he says again, just to remind us all, Romans 7:19, for the good that I will to do, I do not do, but the evil I will not to do, that I practice. And then he goes on, and this is kind of the hope in that passage, because you read that passage in Romans chapter 7 and you go, oh man, that's exactly what I experienced. I had this desire to do what's right, but I can't seem to pull it off. And conversely, I know it's wrong to do certain things, and I find myself doing them, perhaps repeatedly. So St. Paul says, I find that a law that evil is present with me, the one who wills to do good. For I delight in the law of God according to the inward man, but I see another law in my members, warring against the law of my mind and bringing me into captivity to the law of sin, which is in my members. And then he says this, and we've probably all said this in one form or another. He says, oh, wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death? I thank God through Jesus Christ our Lord. In other words, Jesus is the answer to that, right? So it's not just left up to us. And that's why we need to remember that self-control is a fruit of the Spirit. It's a fruit of the Spirit. It's a result of several other things. And I think this is, one more example of divine human synergy. This is such an important concept in Orthodox theology, this dance that we're in with Christ himself, this divine human synergy. It's not either or, all God or all us. It's both and. God is at work as we struggle against the flesh. And by flesh, I don't mean our bodies, but our carnal natures. So one verse I love on this, Anne, is Philippians chapter 2, verses 12 through 13. It says, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. First time I read that, I thought, what? It sounds like it's up to me. I got to work it out. But then St. Paul, apparently feeling no contradiction at all with this, says, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you both to will and to do for his good pleasure. So again, there's this synergy. We're working out our salvation, but God's working in us, to accomplish this salvation. So on the one hand, we don't just, when it comes to self-control, just like some of my Protestant friends would say, let go and let God. I've seen that on t-shirts. I've seen it on coffee mugs. Just let go and let God. No, we're responsible for subjecting our flesh, our carnal nature, not our physical bodies, to the Spirit. St. Paul says in another place, but I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest when I have preached to others, I myself should become disqualified. So very serious about self-discipline, took responsibility for his actions. At the same time, and this is sort of the and part, and we have to remember that it's God who is fighting for us and with us. 1 Chronicles 20:15 says, for the battle is not yours, but the Lord's. I like to remember Dave Ramsey, financial guy, who says it this way. He says, quote, God feeds the birds, but he doesn't throw the worms into the nest. There's this synergy with all of God's creation and him. Does that make sense? Did I miss anything?
No, I love it. Makes a ton of sense. It actually reminds me a lot of why we work hard in the ministry we do and try to have self-control over administration of programs as we're working in ministry. And we say it's all God's work, and that doesn't excuse us from not putting our best efforts to it.
That's
so
right.
It's all our best effort, and it's all God's.
Yep.
Both.
And I think that's, maybe it's not, but that feels like it's really unique to Orthodoxy. I don't know if it is, but we certainly encounter it constantly, everywhere we turn. And, I'm always challenged by how much I need to work, how I need to keep the fast or pray or almsgiving or any of these things. But then I'm always just amazed at how much even that effort, is just all by the grace of God and God's Spirit alive and at work in us.
That's great. So give us some pointers on how we increase self-control, how we gain more self-control.
Okay, so this is where the rubber meets the road. And this list, I'm going to give you a list, and it's not intended to be exhaustive, and I hope it's not exhausting, but it's just kind of some thoughts about how to get more self-control. And I think the older I get, I'm certainly more self-controlled today than I was, 40 years ago, but I still have a long way to go. I still struggle with this, much like St. Paul says in Romans chapter 7. So I think we have to begin by understanding the power of our thoughts. This is where the battle is won or lost, because our thoughts will eventually manifest themselves as words or actions. Proverbs 23:7, as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. So our thoughts are everything. The law of Moses focused on the externals. Don't commit adultery. Don't steal. Don't commit murder. However, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus, understanding this principle, moved from the external to the internal. Don't lust. Don't covet. Don't get angry. Those are the precursors to those other external sins. So if we can kind of go upstream and quench these thoughts, it'll be better. To put it in modern computer terms, garbage in, garbage out. If you've got intake that's negative and destructive, it's going to manifest itself in a negative way. Now, I said at the very beginning, when it comes to self-control, there's both a negative dimension, those behaviors we want to avoid, and a positive dimension, those behaviors we want to cultivate. But based on that, I want to offer just 7 quick, I'm calling these suggestions for cultivating more self-control. Number 1, cultivate self-awareness. And if you didn't watch last week's episode or listen to it, if you're listening by way of podcast, go back and listen to that, because you can't really fix what you're not aware of. And the thing about self-awareness is that it makes us aware of those places where we need to exercise some self-control. Particularly, we need to become aware of the power of our thoughts. I said last week, most people don't think. Some people think about other people's thoughts, and precious few think about their own thinking. And this is where we need to be thinking about our thinking. Those thoughts that are just going through our brain, that are controlling our lives, we can actually begin to take control of those and shape them. And that's where the battle's going to be won or lost. Also, the power of our words. So that's number 1, cultivate self-awareness. Number 2, eliminate negative input. If it's true that garbage in, garbage out, we got to be very careful about what we put in our brains. To quote a verse I shared last week from Romans 12, St. Paul says, don't be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Now, he said that at a time when there was no mass media, there was no social media, there were not movies, there wasn't sort of this cultural force that all of us contend with on a daily basis. So we need to eliminate the things that create negative input, things that provoke anger. If watching the evening news makes you angry, or looking at social media makes you angry, then stop doing it. It's a little bit like that old, I think it was Bob Newhart show, where he is this therapist and he's talking to this patient who's complaining about this thing or another. And he says, well, just stop it. So one of the places where we can stop it is eliminate the things that provoke anger. What about the things that provoke covetousness? And we live in a consumeristic society where we are being sold to constantly, where the number of ads that we see on a daily basis, they're there to make us feel, inadequate, not beautiful, not thin enough, all the different things. And that can provoke a certain sort of covetousness. Anxiety and worry, same thing about news sites or social media. And by the way, all the objective studies I've seen, and you've probably seen these too, Ann, where, if you spend too much time on Facebook, that's a major cause of depression and loneliness and a lot of other very negative emotions. And then I would also eliminate the negative input that provokes lust. And to get real here for a second, there was a Barna Research Group study that was done a few years ago, and it said this. And again, I'm talking to Orthodox clergy and leaders, so I want to make sure everybody that's listening, even if you're not in that category, that's the context. But most pastors, based on their survey, 57%, and this is across all denominations, most pastors, 57%, and youth pastors, 64% admit they have struggled with porn, either currently or in the past. Overall, 21% of youth pastors and 14% of pastors admit they currently struggle with porn. And about 12% of youth pastors and 5% of pastors say they are addicted to porn. So that's got to be eliminated. I'm going to get to some more specifics on some of that kind of thing. So we got to eliminate the negative input. And this is number 3. We need to consume positive input. In psychology, and I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a therapist, but I've been around long enough to know, and I've had therapy and I've talked to therapists. There's a concept called sublimation, where you don't just try to eliminate something, but you try to replace it with something positive. Because if you just try to eliminate it, then, nature abhors a vacuum and those negative thoughts will come rushing back in. It's kind of like if I said to you, whatever you do, don't think about pink elephants. Well, naturally, you're going to think about pink elephants because I just said it. So we have to sublimate that or replace it with something that's more positive. So I think one of the best ways I found in my own life is, and I think this is a good habit as leaders, is cultivate a daily reading habit where you're intentionally by design, getting the kind of input that's going to lead to godly behavior. So certainly reading the scriptures. For years, I've read through the Bible every year. I use the 1 year Bible. You can buy it off of Amazon, and I get it in a different translation every year. But just so that I'm familiar with the scriptures and getting that, the scriptures into my brain. Or reading something like, and by the way, you can just read the daily readings that the church assigns too. Those are available online, the epistle and the gospel. You could read something like the prologue of Orthodox, which I love because you get a little smattering of everything there. Or reading the sayings of the desert fathers or the lives of the saints. One kind of hack for me to get good input is I listen to books while I exercise. Do you do that, Ann?
I do. Or podcasts.
Or podcasts?
It's the way. And actually, there's really good research to suggest that you retain a lot more if you're moving.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's good.
Yeah. Yeah. Light motor activity. It's really good for language learning, especially, but for any kind of memorization or having things sink in if you're moving while you're learning.
Good. Like I very rarely read a book anymore unless I've listened to it first. So I consume a ton of books and podcasts via audio, and it's just kind of an effortless way to do it and to fill my brain with things that are positive and constructive. But that's number 3, consume positive input. So I would encourage those of you who are leaders listening to this to be really intentional. What are you putting into your mind? Garbage in, garbage out. What are you putting into your mind so that the output is what you expect and what you want? Number 4, shape your environment. Be intentional about your environment. Your environment can work for you or against you. It's like if you struggle with eating unhealthy food, clean out the pantry. Get rid of that unhealthy food so you're not tempted. If you struggle with anxiety, depression, or anger, stop watching the news. Maybe avoid social media. If you struggle with lust, use a technology tool like, Apple's got built-in parental controls, but those don't have to just be for parents. You could give that to an accountability partner, another priest, another deacon, somebody who's another leader, and say, hey, I want to restrict the kinds of sites that I can go to, and I want you to enter in the password so this is locked up so I can't do it. There's also a service that I've never tried this, but I've had a lot of people who have used it, who have struggled with lust, who have used this to very positive benefit, and it's called Covenant Eyes. So you can just Google that and you'll be taken right to that site. And I think the thing about the environment that's important, one thing that I was always concerned about, and this is a little old school, but it's been termed the Billy Graham rule. Do you know what that is, Ann?
I don't think I do.
You don't think you do?
I don't think I do. I mean, I know like front page of the New York Times rule, but I don't think I do the Billy Graham rule.
Well, the front page of the New York Times rule is a great one too. But the Billy Graham rule is basically that Billy Graham, he just decided he would never be alone with the person of an opposite sex. And not because, and it's really important for people to hear me say this. It's not because he is a man, because he thought of that women were dangerous or seductresses or anything, but he's just trying to avoid an environment where either one of two things could happen. Either he would be have a temptation that he couldn't overcome, or that it would create a scandal because people would assume that something untoward was happening. So he just decided he wasn't going to do that. So I did the same thing in my entire career. If I had to travel back when I was in the big corporate world, and I could remember having this conversation with my VP of marketing at Thomas Nelson, who was a woman, incredibly bright, very accomplished, had a beautiful family. And I just said, hey, look, we're going to be traveling a lot to different meetings together. And I think it'd be great for us to take just a third person with us. And so that's what we always did. And I went to my boss, who was the CEO of Thomas Nelson. And the first thing he said, of course, was he said, well, it's going to cost money. And I said, true. But, the potential for a scandal is going to be a whole lot more expensive. And I think what this is just realizing our own limitations, our own susceptibility to sin, and just making no provision for the flesh. Does that sound controversial to you?
No. I mean, would it be seen as controversial? Absolutely. Everything can be right now. However, I mean, I look at it as, it's funny. One of my children love sweets, loves them, loves them, loves them. We'll sneak them. We'll find our hidden stashes, and we've talked about, self-control around sweets. And one of the things, that I've shared is like, there are certain sweets I just can't buy at the market because I won't have self-control if they're right there at home. Certain kinds of ice cream where you have to dig to get the cookie dough. Oh, forget it.
You've just tempted me. Now I'm over the edge. I'm thinking about ice cream.
I'm sorry.
Well, no, I like all the scientific research. Like if you read a book like Atomic Habits by James Clear or other research that's been done on, the power of the will, as it turns out, we only have a limited amount of willpower.
Yeah. Great.
Right. And if we do things where we're in an environment where we're really tempted, we exhaust it quickly. This is why when we sin, it's often when we're tired.
Yeah.
We're exhausted. Right. And so this is why we're going to talk about self-care, which I know is not a word you're crazy about, but we're going to talk about this next week and why it's necessary and how it's related to self-control. But let me just say that I don't care what you do to set up your environment. I want to tell a quick story here. I'm trying to be mindful of the clock, but you can do all this stuff and still get yourself in a situation that you didn't create where there could be a temptation. And I had a situation where I was a keynote speaker in Palm Springs, California. Beautiful hotel. I literally just arrived there. It was very fancy. They had a driver pick me up and they took me to this hotel and I was in a suite. And so no sooner had I checked in and put my suitcase on the bed than there was a knock at the door. And I went, oh, that's weird. So I opened the door and there's a woman standing there in what appeared to be nothing but a towel. And she said to me, I've locked myself out of my room. Do you mind if I use your phone? And thank God, I just said, I'll tell you what. How about if I call down to the front desk for you and I'll have them send somebody up? I was shaking in that moment just because I thought, wow, this is like, who knows? And so I immediately called Gail, my wife, who's on listening to the story. It's not the first time she's heard it. So yeah. So I called her and I just explained what was happening. And I just said, thank God I did this. But you want to be in a situation where something like that happens. That's where you want to save the willpower, not in a dumb situation because you haven't taken control of the environment. And that was a situation where I don't know what I could have done differently. But anyway, so shape your environments. Number 4. Number 5, embrace the tools that the church gives us. Thankfully, the church is like a fitness trainer. It gives us the tools that we need, or if you want to use sort of the hospital analogy or metaphor, which we also love, the doctor prescribes things that'll help us to get better. And particularly, and I'm not going to go into these in depth, but prayer, when you stand to pray, that's an act of self-control, especially to keep from getting distracted. And some of us struggle with that a little more than others. Fasting, we learn to say no to the small things so that when we have a big temptation, we have the ability, we've been trained so we can say no to those things. Almsgiving is a great way to say no to ourselves. The resources, the money, whatever we've been given, we're stewards of that. It doesn't belong to us. And there's no better way to remind ourselves of that and to avoid the sin of self-indulgence like giving to other people. Mm-hmm. And then 6, and I'm almost done, surround yourself with godly friends. And this is, I want to come back to this. Even if you're a pastor, you need friends, right? And I quoted, I think last week or maybe the week before when John Maxwell said to me, when I became the CEO of Thomas Nelson, that, he said, you've heard that it's lonely at the top. Well, that's a choice. And so to intentionally cultivate friends, we become like the people we hang out with. Jim Rohn said that you are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. I don't know that that's ever been measured or scientifically tested, but I think directionally it makes a lot of sense. Somebody else said, show me your friends and I'll show you your future. Proverbs 22:24-25 says, don't befriend angry people or associate with hot-tempered people, or you will learn to be like them and endanger your soul. Wow.
Oof.
That's strong medicine.
So
And
good.
then last, find an accountability partner. If you're trying to overcome some sin, or if you're trying to cultivate some positive aspect of self-control, get an accountability partner. Someone that you can check in with, someone that you can really be honest with, someone that's not going to shame you when you fall, but help you get up. And obviously, and just to sum up this whole thing, when you fall, make confession to your father confessor, your priest, and then get back in the fight. It's all of us are going to stumble and fall. That's just the human condition. None of us are going to live a perfect life. And the main thing is that we get back up and we continue the fight.
Oof, that's a great list. So, listeners, we want to get to your questions, or if you have a point, something that really resonated with you that you just want to throw in the chat, we'd love to hear them. Quick summary of what we heard Deacon Michael say. The first is that self-discipline is the ability to think, speak, and act in a way that is congruent with our best intentions and involves both the restraint of negative behavior and the cultivation of positive behavior. It's really hard. There's a lot in our world that draws us to self-indulgence instead of self-control, but that with both our work and with our willingness to have God totally working in us, it's possible to grow in self-control. And so, Deacon Michael, you have 7 amazing recommendations for ways to do this.
Thank you.
Cultivate self-awareness, eliminate negative input, consume positive input, shape your environment, embrace the tools the church gives us, surround yourself with godly friends, and find an accountability partner. So with that, it looks like we have some questions. The first one is, what to do with a person who lacks self-control? If you don't talk to him, it's not good. If you do talk to him, it's still not good for you. If you leave him, does he accuse you of leaving him?
Yeah, it's particularly difficult in the church. In private business, like I'm in, if I talk to somebody and they don't change, then I have a choice to make, and I can, get rid of them. Much harder to do in the church, right? Plus, in the church, we have the hope. It's our fundamental ministry, the ministry of reconciliation and redemption. But I do think it has to begin with the truth. And one of the things that happens, and Emmy, I see you asked that question. I'm not accusing you of being guilty at this. We don't know each other, but I think a lot of times people will talk about somebody, but they won't talk to somebody. And this is so critically important that you sit down with the person who's annoying you or is sinning against you in some way, and you have what I call an adult conversation. You don't do it in a spirit of anger, but you follow the admonition of the Lord in Matthew chapter 18. If your brother sins, go and reprove him in private. Now, what we often do is if our brother sins, we go and ask for prayer for that person, right? That's just kind of that's the spiritual way of gossiping. We ask for prayer for that person instead of going directly to that person and confronting them, because ultimately that person is the only one that can fix the problem. And I quoted from Galatians 6:1 last week, and let me just look at that real fast so I can quote it. It says, "Brethren, if a man is overtaken in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness." That gentleness component is really important. "Considering yourself, lest you also be tempted." So that same sin, it could fall to us. We could be guilty of it ourselves. So we always have to be mindful of that. But in a spirit of gentleness, we have to correct them. Now, in that passage in Matthew chapter 18, there's a whole escalation process. Go and reprove your brother in private. If he listens to you, you've won your brother. Great, celebrate. Everything turned out. If he does not listen to you, take 1 or 2 with you so that out of the mouth of, 2 or more witnesses, every fact may be confirmed. And then ultimately, tell it to the church, so it escalates, from there. To be honest, I've rarely, a couple times, but rarely see it escalate beyond that initial confrontation. A lot of times people are just unaware that they're doing that thing that's driving you crazy. Or if they're confronted, they'll change. Again, not always, but that's kind of not your responsibility. Your responsibility is to speak the truth in love, as St. Paul says in Ephesians chapter 4.
I have another question here for you, and I love it, and I'll tell you why I love it. But the question is, some people seem to be naturally able to be disciplined. Any tips or tools to help those of us who aren't, quote, wired this way? Can you repeat your list for how to get more self-control? I think about it, especially, I'm a P on Myers-Briggs, right? Actually leaning very close to J, but for those of us who we really buck routine, we buck this sort of discipline part of things. What advice do you have for those of us?
Well, the person who asked that question, I know intimately because I've been married to her for 43 years, and she also on the Myers-Briggs is a P, but maybe not so close to the J. And I would say to those people, first of all, none of those personality traits, and you know this, Anne, and Gail knows this too because we've talked about it a lot. None of those personality traits are good or bad, right or wrong. They just express how you typically respond in various situations, and there's enormous benefit to it. But I would say in a situation like that where you're naturally not disciplined, that you limit the number of disciplines that you take on. In other words, you don't try to take on too much because it's not your natural inclination. And I think this is, as I try to work with leaders to build habits, one of the things I know for sure is you can't take on too many habits at one time. Mm. They seem deceptively easy. You think, well, I'm going to start doing this and I'm going to do that. And I'm going to give, this always happens like right after the first of the year, New Year's resolutions. But people can't sustain it typically because they're taking on too much. And again, and Emmy pointed this out too, self-regulation, self-discipline, self-control, whatever word you want to use, that's a finite resource. And willpower, you only got a certain amount of it each day. So you got to choose your battles. So limit the number of habits that you're trying to build, number of places you're trying to exercise self-control, and then realize it's going to take longer than you think. Like I used to always hear this thing that to build a new habit takes 21 days, which would be awesome. But there was some research that came out of Oxford that said, or maybe it was the University of London, that said actually it can take up to 100 days, but the average is 66 days. So if you do something every day for 66 days, then you got a good chance of that being the terminology that I've used in my work is I call it installed. That habit is installed. It's on automatic pilot. You don't think about it anymore. Like just to give you an example, I've been reading the Bible every day for decades. I don't even think about that. It never occurs to me that that's a choice in the morning, that like, oh, well, today I got to read my Bible. No, I just do it. It's literally the first thing I do when I wake up, or one of the first things I do when I wake up. That's an installed habit. There are other things that I'm trying to do that working on some habits now that I really got to think about. And I got to really, plan how I do it and when I do it and all that stuff to make sure that it gets done.
It's great. Well, we are just at time now. So, Deacon Michael, we so appreciate you being here guiding us through these incredibly important lessons on self-discipline.
Thank you.
Thank you to our audience for joining us live tonight. We will be back again here, God willing, next week at the same time. We plan to discuss the third and final installment of this mini-series on leadership disciplines. Last week, we discussed self-awareness as a leadership discipline. This week, we discussed self-control as a leadership discipline. Next week, we'll be discussing self-care as a leadership principle. If that word, self-care, makes you cringe a bit, as it does me, you already said, we will be talking about it, appropriate self-care, the kind that better equips us to serve others. My favorite term is refueling time. So we can't wait to dig into that next week. Deacon Michael, as we wrap up, do you have any final thoughts?
No, I just think self-control is not a destination. It's all about the journey. And until the day we die and go to be with the Lord, God willing, this is going to be a challenge. And we just need to stay in the fight. It's important to our leadership.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anne.